What if a single accident, one you didn't even cause, could bankrupt your entire company? Today we're sitting down with a personal injury attorney, Aaron, to pull back the curtain on the terrifying world of nuclear verdicts and the legal tactics driving settlements into the tens of millions of dollars. We explore why the standard $750,000 worth of insurance is no longer enough to protect you, and the hidden dangers of your MCS-90 and the legal trap called joint and several legal liability that could leave you for paying for somebody else's mistake. If you think your fleet is safe, you've got to hear this. That's next.
Welcome to the Trucking Risk and Insurance Podcast.
How to manage the safety department like an expert without the 30-year learning curve. If you want to lead the safety department like a veteran and you don't want to spend years in the hot seat learning it the hard way or decades of trial and error, text the word success to 365-364-0714.
So I'm Aaron. I'm an attorney here at BD&J. I practice, personal injury in the state of California and Nevada. My focuses are, automobile accidents, slip and falls, trucking accidents, motorcycle. So there's a lot of high exposure there, and I like what I do, and the motor vehicle accidents are a little bit more interesting to me.
Being from the state of California, there's a little bit of money at stake here because of nuclear verdicts and stuff like that. So,
definitely. Juries in California, they sometimes there's like Reptile Theory involved, and that kind of spark up these nuclear verdicts, and they could be large, which also poses an issue for trucking industry, for the insurers, and of course the carriers. Part of something that's important is insurance and having adequate insurance.
Well, look, you just brought up Reptile Theory.
Oh, yes.
Johnny and I love Reptile Theory. However, maybe some of the viewers don't know what Reptile Theory is and how it's used in a courtroom. Can you explain a little bit about Reptile Theory?
Well, Reptile Theory is, it's kind of using the jury's emotion and, anger and frustration against, big corporations who might have wronged the client or the plaintiff in the case. One way or another, people have their reservations about trust in big corporations. So,
ain't that the truth?
Well, and sadly, I just had a conversation earlier this week with a defense attorney, and he was talking about, in particularly in the U.S., there are conferences for plaintiff attorneys to learn how to apply the reptilian theory and work at getting nuclear verdicts, and they're providing tricks of the trade during these conferences.
They have the same thing for the defense attorneys, but hey, Aaron, why do you think trucking liability is, one, rising, but bloody well getting out of hand? Trucking liability insurance, the premiums are going up. What's behind it?
So, right now, an issue we're having right now is the premiums are going up, due to increased medical costs and other factors as well. But, premiums are going up, but coverage is going down in some avenues. We're having trucking companies that are underreporting their drivers, which it causes an issue there. And we also have an increase in medical expenses. Also coverage is generally low compared to what it should be. These limits were drawn out in the 80s. Back when a spinal fusion was, $10 or $15,000. Today we're looking at numbers that are 10 times that amount. And cost of living has gone up. Life care plans are higher. Salaries are also higher. So your economic and non-economic damages could create a large exposure for these trucking companies.
Yeah, it's getting crazy out there with the liability that everybody's exposed to, not just trucking companies, but everybody. But when we're operating on the highways, especially in some states, I imagine that Texas and California, the verdicts are typically higher than in Montana, for example. Would you agree with that?
I would agree with that. Part of it is, cost of living, cost of medical expenses, wages, because something we do try to recover for our clients, or loss of past and future wages. And, it differs state to state. And, it's all part of it. Once you have a life care plan where a client has millions of dollars of, future medical care and loss of earnings, it affects like the geography of, how the case is going to go forward.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that's interesting is, when you put in place your filings for your insurance coverage, the U.S. requires a minimum of $750,000 worth of liability insurance. Due to some of the high costs of what we're seeing in some of the litigation, we're seeing a lot of insurance companies who are going, you know what? We don't want to insure you for $5 million anymore. We're going to insure you up to $2 million. That's all we're going to give you now, or something along that line. But what's funny is it really makes me, because you touched on it there, the cost of things from the 80s and today have, tenfold increased. But what's interesting is that $750,000 minimum has not changed, which is
Correct.
surprising, and I know there's been talk about it within the U.S. government circles about getting that up, but it's funny because they keep going, well, we don't want to raise it because it would be a detriment to the motor carrier, but at the same time, would it not help protect the motor carrier better if we had higher limits there?
Definitely. Right now, with a $750,000 limit, a lot of small fleets, they kind of don't understand what happens with that. One spinal surgery costs $200,000. And, in a trucking accident, it's not always one truck versus one vehicle. It's right. One truck versus multiple, or, in those situations where there's a vehicle pileup, tens of vehicles can be involved. And that $750,000 is swallowed up quickly. And, for trucking companies, that will create excess exposure to them. And for my clients, it will be to huge detriment to, their recovery and their ability to, have medical care provided. And in the case of like loss of like death, loss of a loved one, or something more like a serious injury, like a paraplegic, it's devastating.
Well, we're seeing some of these verdicts coming out that are in the tens of millions of dollars for the reward to the plaintiff. And the sad part is the motor carrier's got $750,000 worth of coverage. So they're now forced to liquidate their assets, terminate employees, could be sued in a civil case, could be sued personally. It's just a huge detriment. These motor carriers are not protecting themselves adequately by any means. You're hitting on it, with medical injuries and stuff like that. But even if we went and said, okay, not even a medical injury, but maybe if we had a ruptured fuel tank in that crash, now we've got an environmental exposure, and those are expensive.
Right. So, touch up on that, environmental concerns, that could be a lot more than just the $2 million for sure.
Yeah.
And, these verdicts are big, and, there's there's a lot that goes to it. A lot of people think, oh, you know, a $8 million or $10 million verdict could be very high, but you know, there's a lot of costs involved. There's a lot of medical expenses, and you know, for someone that you know lost a loved one, just the pain and suffering aspect of it alone can, you know, eat that whole like judgment.
Yeah.
Yeah. What,
Now,
what do you think drives this underinsured problem with some of these smaller fleets? What is it that's doing it? Misinformation, uneducated motor carriers, bad brokers, or
I'd say a
what do you think?
mixture of all, and lack of information. You know, most like smaller fleets, like mom and pop trucking companies, you know, they're trying to save money anywhere they can, and they don't realize that, you know, all it takes is one accident to, you know, bankrupt them, and that's something that you know needs to be avoided, and you know, be to educate smaller fleets on, because no one wants to be in that position. The trucking, truck drivers don't want to be in that. The insurance companies don't either, especially the victims. So,
yeah, where for small trucking fleets, where do you see a gap or underinsurance?
I would say where the trucking fleet, you know, reports one driver, but then another driver's operating the vehicle. So then the insurance carrier comes around and says, "Oh, you know, we don't know this driver. He's not covered, and we're denying coverage." And they do that to try to avoid, you know, potential bad faith claims or, you know, just liability on the claim itself, and that saves them money.
Well, yeah, I mean, if the insurance company legally has no reason to cover the claim and it's a bad one, they will look to opt out. But isn't that a moral risk on the part of the insured?
On the part of the insured, yes,
Because they're lying, basically.
yes, and they are, and it happens often. You know, more often than you would think, because
Wow.
there, you know, it happens in the workers' compensation aspect, which is a whole different thing, but it happens here as well, where they're trying to avoid paying maybe hundreds of dollars a month extra, and you know, risking their institution, risking the lives of other people, and exposing themselves to personal liability, even in some cases. So it's definitely a problem that needs to be addressed. How to do it would probably be stricter regulations, maybe penalties for underreporting drivers. Um, you know,
Well,
yeah,
the whole thing there, and God, it's been 10 years since I worked for an insurance company, so my brain is getting a little foggy. But
What
it,
was it because you worked at an insurance company it's gotten foggy, or just since you worked in the insurance?
that was the best job I had.
because of that.
What I was going to say, in correct me, Aaron, because I'll say it wrong probably, but if when you apply for insurance, if you mislead the insurance carrier on potential risk and things specifically that would affect the insurance premium, is that not a reason for the insurer, the insurance company, not to cover a claim?
It is, and you know, rightfully so. You know, you're being asked questions that you're not truthfully, you know, admitting to. So the insurance company does have a right to deny coverage. However, there's other situations where, you know, at the time they thought it was just one person that's driving the vehicle, but then they added new employees and they forgot to report it. That could get a little bit more, you know, fuzzy to say.
Yeah.
Well, because one's an error and one's a lie. And there
Right.
is a huge difference between human error And how do you prove which is which in the case? That's often how it comes down to in the courts, of course.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Because
That's why a lot of these cases do get litigated.
yeah, it's huge. And especially in the US, as you're well aware, nuclear verdicts, and for our audience, a nuclear verdict is generally anything that settles at 10 mil or more. But nuclear verdicts are regular events now,
Yeah.
especially when it comes to trucking. How
I remember years ago, we used to call anything over $1 million a shock loss. Now it's just like, oh, you got lucky.
what what would you say to the insurance companies? Why do they fight these claims so aggressively? We're talking about looking for reasons for denial and things like that. Why are the trucking insurance companies getting really aggressive?
It's because they know that, one bad accident can exceed their entire policy limit instantly. And, they do this to protect themselves. And that's why they deny either liability or, argue coverage if that's an issue. Or, blame it on a phantom vehicle or some other thing to try to avoid it because they know that their coverage isn't enough. So they do this to also protect their insured's potential exposure.
Right. And the other thing, I just had a client last week call me up to say, why is my insurance company telling me I needed my own attorney? And John's laughing already. And I said to him, well, is this a bad loss? Well, yeah, it was a fatal. I said, then your insurance company is likely telling you that they suspect it's going to settle above policy limits, which they're not going to be liable for. Therefore, they want you to have your own lawyers to mitigate the loss. And this fellow was a foreigner, so I'm trying to say it in simple English language, basically telling him that they're very exposed when your insurance company tells you to get your own damn lawyers. How often does that happen, do you think?
Well, the insurance company may have a duty to defend, but their duty to cover is within the limits that they have, and this does happen often, and it's for other reasons as well, including a conflict. The insurance company may have their best interest in mind, but they can assign cumulus counsel for the insured to be able to ensure that their what's important to them and their rights aren't being infringed upon, because insurance companies are thinking about their interests and their policy, and if it's if there's some things that might be conflicting between the two, they should have their own counsel that's guiding them through it.
Well, and to add to what Chris was talking about, depending on the circumstances of the severity of the claim and the limits of your policy, your insurer could be quick to go, you know what, we're just going to settle. We're just going to pay out the max because that'll be cheaper than trying to fight this. It'll carry on and go over. And hey, our limits are only, say, $1 million with you. So, this is going to go $3 million easily. So all we're going to do is go $1 million, and then it's up to you, Mr. Motor Carrier, to come up with the rest.
Yeah, and they often do that. And that's how there could be, and by the insurance company doing that, they're protecting themselves and also trying to protect the interests of their insured. It's the right thing to do. However, when you're running into an issue where medical expenses are high, and then you have damages that far exceed the $750,000 limit that's placed under the federal government, and, the attorney and the client are like between a rock and a hard place. Do we accept this and move on, or try to go after the trucking company personally? And it's a whole different kind of animal, because you're going to have to, sue them, get a judgment against them, enforce it, collect, and have collection firms try to collect on that, which also takes a hit on the plaintiff's recovery.
Yep.
So you're running into a bunch of different issues at that point.
Yeah.
I'll tell you, the trucking industry is heavily exposed just because they do so many miles on the roads that the chance of being involved in a collision are extremely high. Can you take a minute and talk about, oh my God, just escaped me, the legal term, Johnny.
Dancing in the street?
Yeah, that's a legal term, but
Purple
okay,
rain?
I'll come back to it when I remember what I wanted you to explain. Let's change to the MCS-90. Why is misrepresenting the drivers hurting the trucking company itself when you're talking about the MCS-90?
So it could hurt the trucking industry itself because, under the MCS-90, it only applies to certain kinds of, commercial vehicles. It doesn't apply to all of them. One of the requirements is that the truck is, traveling interstate, like not out of state, not interstate. So with that being, if there's a coverage issue, the federal government can come in and have the insurance company pay it to the plaintiff, but then the trucking company itself has to reimburse it to the insurance company later on. So insurance companies can come in and try to get the funds that they paid from the trucking the trucking company, which creates more exposure and an issue where they could even go bankrupt depending on how big the amount is.
Well, one of the things is, and I know I've had this conversation with many a client to kind of educate them on some simple math. So I'll give an example. Here in Canada, minimum limits, if you're operating into the U.S., minimum limits you can get in Canada are $2 million because $750 is the minimum in the U.S. And by the time you add exchange and whatnot, we're well over $1 million. And insurance companies only insure in $1 million increments. So we have to have a minimum of $2 million to go stateside. And I would say, on average, somewhere between $15,000 to $20,000 a power unit to give you $2 million worth of liability coverage. And it usually includes cargo and physical damage and whatnot. So in essence, when you think about it, let's just use round numbers of $20,000 for $2 million worth of coverage. That's $2 million of coverage that I have every day of the year for 365 days of the year. And that's for every truck I have on the fleet. And it cost me 20 grand. In essence, I look at it and go, wow, 20 grand is pretty cheap. I screw up, I pay 20 grand this term, depends on what happens next year. But if I have a crash that goes $2 million, I've got $2 million at my disposal to take care of that claim. And it only cost me 20 grand. So motor carriers get all wound up in knots when all of a sudden their rates go up to $60,000 and $70,000 a power unit because they've had so many crashes. But they can't seem to take into the simple math that, unfortunately, insurance companies, like any other business out there, do not like to lose money. They're hedging a bet. They're offering you a insurance policy to cover you in the event of, and unfortunately, motor carriers are looking at it like, I got to have insurance. Oh, this is an unnecessary evil. This is terrible. Why can't I just go truck it up and down the road? Well, I don't see you having the ability to put up $2 million yourself for every truck in the fleet, not just one bundle of $2 million. It's multiple bundles in the event throughout the year you have multiple crashes. So it's kind of unfortunate because I think it's too easy to get into the industry for one, and you get a lot of them that are not properly educated to understand the simple formula of mathematics of why you need certain amounts of money for insurance. And then a guy like Aaron comes along and gets to go, Well, I can prove to you why you need to have that kind of number, because here's the stats on what we see when we go to court to fight these claims.
Right. And, like you guys were saying before, the risk involved is very high. You're having to go drive every single day, 365 days, probably working over 14 hours.
Well, we hope not more than 14 hours in a day. Come on now.
Hours of service.
That certainly opens the door for Aaron.
Yeah.
More litigation.
It does happen. And, these trucking companies, they have their quotas where they need, freight to be able to arrive somewhere in a certain time. So that causes them to be sleep deprived, caffeine dependent, maybe other dependencies to try to get to their destination. And, this also creates a higher risk to everyone on the road, which...
Yeah. Well, and you know what? It's interesting because insurance was created for everybody to put money into, and it there to support the small number of folks that have a problem, right? Because it's not meant that everybody's going to have a problem. And I think in the industry as a whole, the transportation industry is pretty good at what they do. But those few that are causing some problems, maybe a little more frequency, but definitely, as you'd mentioned earlier on, the cost of medical care, medical treatment, environmental, the price of trucks nowadays are really driving up the cost of these claims.
Right.
Aaron, let me ask you one last question as we're getting to the end. And this one you didn't know was coming. But
did you remember that legal term, Chris?
Yeah, I did. Joint and several legal liability. Because this is something that a lot of, especially small fleets, don't understand. They're involved in a crash and it's not their fault.
Yep.
But there's this thing called joint and several legal liability. Can you briefly explain the exposure to trucking companies with that?
Yes. So if there's, an accident where there's multiple vehicles involved, if the other people cannot pay it, and the truck might have to pay it based on the joint and several liability. So that also creates the exposure here. It's if one person can't pay it, the other party has to.
Yeah. So, I just want everybody to hear that. It doesn't even have to be your fault. But if the one party can't pay, and for simplicity's sake, let's say the party who can't pay, it was their fault, but you're involved, your insurer may have to step up to the plate. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. Even if your fault is very minimal, as long as you have like a percentage of liability, your insurer can come into play.
Yeah. Well, and it's sad because we see this throughout U.S. states. Each state differs on the minimum amount of liability you need. And there are actually some states that you only need to have $25,000. And it's just like, oh, what? Holy crap, my car's worth more than that. And I don't even have enough to cover the car, let alone any liability or bodily injury claim or anything along that line. So it's, this is where that joint and several comes into play, right?
Yeah, and that also happens where some trucks, they're kind of borderline commercial or non-commercial. So you could have a truck that looks like a commercial vehicle be covered under state minimum limits of like $30,000. In California.
Yeah.
So
it's
scary.
It's interesting. So yes, Johnny, I did remember joint and several legal liability. It's something that a lot of small fleets don't understand when their insurance company is paying out hundreds and sometimes millions of dollars on their behalf. And it goes on the small trucking company's loss run and their rates go up and they have no idea why. That's even on their loss run when it wasn't their fault.
I actually had that years ago, back in 2002, I think it was. I had a crash down in the bottom end of Arkansas where a lady lost control of her vehicle. and hit my truck and took out my front wheel, and then off in the median I went. And sadly, she was from Oklahoma, never driven in the snow before. We had a little bit of snow on the road, and she had no clue what it was. She had her sister in the vehicle. They both had bodily injury. My truck had about $75,000 damage done to it. Her maximum liability that she had in place, $25,000. So my insurance company just simply went, you know what? Yeah, joint and several liability. You weren't at fault. However, you were involved, and there's no money to actually go after to help repair our own vehicle. We've got to pay for it ourselves. We couldn't even go after her personal assets because she didn't have any. So.
Yeah. With that, that's a great place to wrap it up. Aaron, thanks so much for coming on to the Trucking Risk and Insurance podcast. And thanks for coming on the show, Aaron. Your contact info is in the show notes down below. I would encourage you to reach out to Aaron if you've got questions. Thanks so much for tuning in to this week's podcast on the Trucking Risk and Insurance podcast. We are out of here. See you next week.